Working today on our 2007 Mercedes C230. Problem here, which I assume is a pretty common problem because it broke on both sides. So I'm going to be fixing both sides, but operation is the same for both of them. You can see this piece here has broken off. Now I've already fixed it once, but the resin plastic epoxy that I used was actually too hard. So I'm going to be using a higher bond that actually has a little bit of flex in it to account for the flex that happens in the door. Now the issue is, if you got this, you don't want to just pull it out and cram some glue in there or epoxy and close it. The reason being that in order to take the panel off, the screw is actually on the inside of the handle here. And this partially accounts for why the handle breaks so easily, because it's actually only a half moon. It's only half of the handle that is epoxied into the door panel. So what you have to do is, you can see there's a seam running along here, and you have to pop this outer part off in order to gain access to the back there, so that you don't actually glue in where the screw goes in there, because that would be very unfortunate, because then you could not get the door panel off. So for this part, you'll notice if you look through up and down, there's no screws or anything. You're actually going to just take a screwdriver and very gently separate this, and it is just held in there by clips. And so again, you want to just work it very carefully and pop that piece off. And same thing on the back side. Just work your thin blade screwdriver back there, turning it, and see, pop, pop, pop. The pieces will come off. Then you can extract the outer part. See, and that is the issue, is that this is the part that actually holds it together, right? You would think that this part is, you know, what's holding it into the door, and it's not. That's only holding it into this piece here, which of course you can replace. If you replace it completely, then you have to remove the door panel, which also isn't a terrible disassembly. Before I started making these videos, I pulled the door panel to replace the driver window controls, which was not terribly hard nor expensive. So the door panel actually is not a terribly difficult operation, but again, the key is that when you're gluing this, you need to leave access here to the inside. So again, there's a number of ways that you can do this. What I'm going to be doing today is I'm just going to use my wire brush to clean back the epoxy that's in there to give me a bondable surface, and then just hit this with epoxy around the rim there and get it to set. Now the other thing you can do is take the door panel completely off, take the handle completely off, and epoxy it while it's off the door panel. The difficulty there, and I think it partially accounts for why my weld didn't hold for just a few months, is the fact that it's hard to hold these pieces together while they're out. Now while they're in, it'll be relatively simple for me to get this to set in there, and I'll just have to hold it in place for a little bit. And again, that's where the issue is right here. You have this ring, and all of that is actually screwed into the door, and it separates from that handle. It's unfortunate because, you know, Mercedes has really high build quality, very well engineered, very well designed, but every now and then poor quality, something like this will sneak in, and this just needed to be a higher gauge, a higher quality plastic. But so basically I'm going to be using some JB Weld, some of the black high tensile that does have a little bit of give. The stuff that I used on there first was more like fiberglass. I mean, it was still a JB Weld epoxy resin, but it was harder, and it did not hold in the long run because of the fact that it was just too hard, and it did not allow for any give, and eventually it snapped. So again, I'm going to take my wire brush, brush this back a little bit. Don't have to do a whole lot, because it's, you know, actually the epoxy that's still there will help to give me a good bond. I'm just going to wire brush it to a brazed surface and then take my screwdriver with the epoxy once I've mixed it and gently brush it into this crescent right here where it attaches. Alright, so I cleaned up the seam there. Again, I didn't get rid of all the old epoxy because it'll actually help to bond what I'm doing here. But clean that up with my wire brush here. I got my Dremel, my wire brush. This is the plastic bonder, JB Weld, that I'm using. It's 15 minutes set, so it'll squirt out in 2 colors like that, and you have to mix them. Once you've got them mixed, also when you put the cap back on, make sure that you put the right side on there. So white to white, black to black, because you don't want to mix those, because then of course it would adhere and never come off again. So you will want to mix those. Once you get them into a nice even color, then apply. Again, I'm going to be using that small flat blade and just pulling this back ever so slightly, working it into the groove, being careful not to get it on the leather around it, but just on the plastic. And once I've got a good amount of it in there, I'm just going to hold it in place for the 15 minutes while it bonds. So pretty straightforward and ultimately not a very difficult operation to complete. Again, the key is not to rush into it and just goop in the stuff in there, because again, it's very important that you have access to that screw back there, or else you're not going to be able to get your door panel off. So here I have the JB Weld epoxy now in there. Another important thing, I'm holding it in place here, another important thing is to make sure that you don't restrict the ability of the outer trim piece of the handle to insert in there. So after you've got a good amount in the groove where the 2 pieces are connecting, you want to just keep painting it. You know, I also came over on the inside so it bonds, you know, in a nice big blob. So it's not just in the hole, but you know, I used the screwdriver to keep going around the outside to around the rim of the circle there, in order to make sure that it would still allow the other trim piece to go in there. As I'm holding it, if you let go ever so slightly, you can see the seam start to appear, and so that tells you it's still not quite set. And if you push it in too much, then it bubbles out. So you want to hold it at a pressure where the epoxy is nice and flat on the surface of the crack of the seam that you're coupling. But basically at this point it's just a waiting game. So I'm going to sit here and hold this in place for about 15 minutes. Of course, you can watch your palette, what's left on the piece of cardboard or plate or whatever you've got for mixing it, and you can see it hardening. So you know, 15 minutes is the dry time. Now of course you're not going to want to immediately start yanking on the door. I would recommend leaving it overnight until you actually start utilizing the door handle again to pull the door shut, just to make sure it has ample time to adhere and dry real well. So my motto has always been to work smart, not hard, and the epoxy, because it is a little cooler today, is going a little slower than expected for setting. So I thought, hey, you know, rather than waste my time sitting here just holding it, I can get a better bond by wrapping a ratchet tie down. And you can see I've got it underneath the top hinge, below the middle hinge, or underneath the top, above the middle hinge, wrapped around there. That gives it just the right amount of tension on there so that it's nice and even pressure, and it's just about set on this side. And that way it also freed me up so that I could go ahead and do the other side as well. You also notice that I've got a bungee cord here, because not only does it need to be pushed in, but it also needs to be pulled back just a wee bit to get it exactly the right spot. So with that combination of a bungee cord pulling back and the ratchet tie down giving pressure there. It's holding it in place just perfectly, and this will provide a very nice strong bond that hopefully will last for a good long while. So I just went ahead and left the ratchet tie downs on the doors for a couple hours just to make sure it cured good and strong, and it is definitely in there quite strong now. You know, it's best not to be putting a lot of pressure on it for the first 24 hours just to make sure it cures real strong. This piece, just a matter of pushing it back into the bracket. You can see it's got these little diagonal pieces, so it kind of pops up and in, and that's really all there's to it. Just a matter of getting all those pieces aligned in there, and you might have to you know, take a little bit of sandpaper if it's a little too tight, but that actually, you know, as long as you can work it back in there, it's going to keep it good and taut in there. Again, you just want to make sure you don't put this back in until this is good and cured, because you don't want this to get glued into the door. But otherwise, that is a pretty easy and straightforward operation for fixing one of these without having to actually purchase new door handles, because otherwise the handles are in fine shape. Just a matter of that one weak point on the bracket there, and so we should be good to go for a good long while now. And here we have the finished product, all nice and new back in there, and very sturdy. That JB Weld that I showed you, this kind here, the nice thing about it is that it actually has a little bit of give to it. It is just slightly soft. It doesn't get brittle. Again, that was the issue with the first epoxy that I used on the other door, was it was too brittle, and so it just cracked one day. This, I think, will hold much better, and already we have good structural integrity, and just looking at it, you would not know that it was ever broken. So project successful, and rather than having to spend, I think these pieces are maybe like $50 a piece for the handles, spent $4 or $5 for a thing of JB Weld, so and did it myself, so no labor cost. So successful project, and very easy to do. Just do it yourself project. Anybody can do it, and only takes, you know, just a little bit of time and effort.